Good evening. We're going to begin our speech on whether the death penalty is effective in the US. So the death penalty, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, states that as of March 26, 2021, 3 people have already been executed this year, while there is another follow-up one scheduled for April 20th, 2021. This should surprise no people to US citizens, since according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, there have been 1,491 executions since 1976. Within that 45-year span, that's 33 executions per year. Though, is this really the most effective way to deal with the issue? The implications of the existence of the death penalty extend into the greater realm of our society, as government-imposed termination of human life is a highly controversial concept in its own respect. Our government's role in execution is particularly relevant because the citizens in this country vote to elect politicians that have the power to either implement or remove capital punishment. Thus, it is important that the voting population is aware of the shortcomings and deleterious effects so that they can decide for themselves if they want to make a difference on election day. We can see through the evidence and reasoning that the death penalty does not deter crime, actively cost the citizens more money, and as well as an inhumane way to treat people. One might think that the death penalty would deter those who sought to commit some heinous crime. However, there is a little evidence that shows that it does anything to these numbers. Criminals who plan to commit murder, sell drugs, commit an act of terrorism, amongst other crimes, do not intend to get caught or have already resigned themselves to death. Amnesty International provides evidence from the United States and Canada. Within the United States, the murder rate for states with the death penalty on average is 5.71 per every 100,000 people, compared to 4.02 per 100,000 in those who do not practice. This small range shows that the crime rate, especially murder, does not fall within the death penalty when the death penalty is employed. In fact, within Canada, following 27 years without the death penalty, the crime rate had fallen 44%. This shows that there is no correlation between utilizing the death row and crime rates. Furthermore, the Journal of Empirical Legal states that following the 1993 repeal of the death penalty in Hong Kong caused no shift in the homicide rate. After it was abolished, there was a slight rise in homicide rates for 2 years before a steady fall actually occurs. These results provide evidence that the death penalty does not prevent nor cause a sharp decline in crime rates. The United States having death row does not cause any changes to the crime rate, thus there is no point in utilizing it to deter crimes.
So when people usually think of the death penalty, they usually assume it is a process where someone's sentenced to death and is simply executed and the situation is dealt with. But it goes a lot deeper than that. A 2011 study conducted by Loyola Marymount University found that capital punishment since 1978 has cost taxpayers in California $4 billion more than if there were a comparable system without capital punishment, utilizing life in prison without parole instead. Furthermore, the same study estimated that if the same system is to be kept in place until 2050, it would cost an additional $5 to $7 billion, keep in mind, just in California, to fund, where a significant portion of inmates are expected to pass away due to other factors besides execution, such as old age. All of this data suggests that not only is the system of having the death penalty very expensive for the taxpayers overall, but a system that uses life sentences without parole would be significantly cheaper, as the waiting period from sentencing to actual execution means that a notable percentage of those convicted are likely to pass away from other factors. And as you can see by the chart on the right there, from data collected by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the average time between sentencing and execution has gone up sharply from 1984 up to 2013, where the average span of sentencing and execution went from 74 months all the way up to 186. That's the average, by the way. So it could be a lot more than that for some inmates, unfortunately. Furthermore, the Death Penalty Information Center factors in things such as legal costs, the unique circumstances of trials due to the serious nature of the crimes that may justify the death penalty in some places, and the appeal process in place for those on death row as reasons for the overall higher cost of capital punishment. They also reported that the Federal Bureau of Prisons spent $4.7 billion on just 5 executions between the months of July and August of 2020, with the vast majority of those costs coming from the assembling, transporting, and housing of execution teams, including over $100,000 on just hotel costs. It also found that with the average cost of incarceration currently, the cost per execution exceeded the amount needed to house a federal inmate for 25 years, showing that both the federal and the state levels are spending so much money to execute such a small amount of people. It's difficult to justify such a system that seems very flawed. And housing inmates for life sentences is actually a much more reasonable option financially than putting them to death.
While my colleague Michael talked about the financial burdens of the death penalty, I'm going to talk about the inhumanity of the death penalty, as it is clearly an inhumane act. And that not only includes the death penalty itself, it also includes the method of which it is executed. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1976, the most common form of execution has come in the form of lethal injection. And on top of that, roughly 7% of injections, a mind-blowing number when you think about it, which equates to roughly 100 people, have been subjected to botched executions. Botched executions are unusually cruel and inhumane in their nature and cause a lot of pain and suffering to the inmates during the execution. And this could be considered a savage method of justice. And most of the world has actually moved on from the death penalty, or at least most of the Western world. Government-sanctioned executions are actually absent in most European countries, particularly in Germany, according to Denny LaBeouf, who is a writer from the ACLU. And due to Germany's past transgressions and the Nazi Party's history in Germany, government-sanctioned executions have been passed up on, and life sentences are more common in the case of heinous crimes. And a global shock would occur in the case of Germany carrying out executions due to this past. Moving on to the racial disparity, according to Warren Gignock, who is a part of Exponents Mag, and also demonstrated in the pie chart, you can see that there is a disproportionate amount of African Americans who are subjected to execution of the inmates on death row. And that's according to the Death Penalty Information Center. And unfortunately, this is also the case for Hispanics and other minorities who are also on death row. So obviously, the justice system is incapable of making a correct judgment on the death penalty and the carrying out of executions. So we must take that into consideration when discussing whether the death penalty is just or not. And then moving on to the final point of our discussion, there's also a chance of a wrongly accused person being subjected to the death penalty. And obviously, there's no going back once that happens. And the family will never get any sort of closure or exoneration. So the death penalty is not the best choice in terms of punishment when it comes to that case, because there's innocent people who could lose their lives at the hand of the death penalty. And that wraps up the point of the inhumanity of capital punishment.
All three of these have a counter argument. And when it comes to whether or not it deters crime, we need to look at the cost versus the benefits. Throughout history, the death penalty has been used as a deterrence to heinous crimes. Thus, it has been determined that when evaluating whether the crime rate, specifically homicide rate, decreases, a potential offender must take into account the cost versus these benefits. According to the National Research Council, someone who commits murder may financially gain or remove a potential witness. However, the witness who resists can be detrimental. Overall, possible offenders would be deterred due to the high cost of committing such a crime and risk. Therefore, the death penalty can be seen as a significant factor in determining heinous crimes from being committed. The culprit must weigh the cost versus the benefits from the negative results of being caught, in which they will be discouraged to commit these acts. The ideas of even losing their life if caught is such a high cost for performing these crimes that may not benefit at all. When looking towards the financial situation, we will be looking at compared to other life sentences. When examining costs related to the death penalty, the difference in expenses between a death row inmate versus a life sentence inmate is not as desperate in certain states. So it does not cost more for taxpayers. As reported by Ballotpedia, there are currently 27 states plus the federal government which carry out the death penalty today. And between each of them, they all have different systems and costs associated with carrying out these executions. One in particular, South Dakota, where there is no technical death row, the prisoners are held within the same place as in the life sentence counterparts. And with this practice, there was no additional costs due to not having specialized systems for death row inmates. And by bringing the convicts together, will overall will lower the costs of running these facilities for those that are sentenced to death. And therefore, the death penalty does not truly have any additional costs if you follow the South Dakota model across other states and the government. And to say that it is humane, it could be said that the death penalty is humane through the techniques that it uses. One such technique, like the electrical chair, is meant to kill a person almost instantly upon activation. Though sometimes it does fail and require multiple shocks to finish the execution. There is an argument that unlike in previous history, where the method of execution was either hanging or other ways of prolonged torture, they now have a swift death with little suffering. Any form of execution should be seen as inhumane and barbaric. But what these people are focusing on is the physical pain rather than the mental pain. Santa Clara University committed a study and reported on February 1st, 2005, the finding of the death row syndrome. It is a psychological effect that inmates will go through as part of living on death row, which will slowly cause them to go insane due to isolation, along with the constant thought of imminent death awaiting them. And it'll push them to have suicidal tendencies along with delusions, becoming an active threat to themselves and people around them, though there are no people around them. This is a clear sign of mental abuse that gets put on an inmate. It should be put onto the same pedestal as any other level of physical torture. But overall, capital punishment is one of the most severe form of legal punishment a government can carry out against its own citizens. This concept is not acceptable in countries like Germany, given their past abuses of the population, and perhaps this should be the same case for the United States. The racial disparity in execution is partially a point of concern that can suggest that the justice system is not to be trusted with determining someone's right to live. In recent years, its use has been typically reserved for the most heinous of crimes and the appeal process can drag for decades after the conviction. Moreover, the actual procedure of the execution can often be both usual and inhumane, as displayed in the case of the botched lethal injections. And even in the case where the death row syndrome is somewhat alleviated by executions, the simpler and more humane approach would be to eliminate death row itself. This would also eliminate the need for the aforementioned appeal process, which is usually drawn out over decades and unnecessarily expensive to taxpayers in comparison to the average life sentence. Of the 1,491 lives ended by the capital punishment since 1964, how many suffered by the hands of the government-sanctioned executions? How much more money must be spent in effort to ending these lives? It is difficult to quantify the injustices that might have co-occurred with these acts, but the evidence is significant that the consequences outweigh any derived sense of righteous justice.